Iterator as Boolean statements. I came across this code. I'm unsure as to why the list comprehension doesn't need to catch a stop iteration. How does while itis work as I've tried? And it still prints still true in both cases. The author of the code also said because map returns a one-shot iterable in 3.x, and as soon as we've run the list comprehension inside the loop once, itis will be exhausted but still true, and residential will be forever. He suggested to use list, map, itis, args, instead if we're using 3.x. I'm unsure of how this change actually helps it to work, as I thought that even if iterators are at the stop iteration point it still is true, based on what I tried earlier. Edit. The author gave this as an example.
There are several aspects to the question. Python 2.x. The map returns a list and the while itis just makes sure that the code doesn't go into the loop in case there were no asterisk args passed into the function. That's because an empty list is considered false and a not empty list is considered true. In case there are no asterisk args, it won't enter the loop and implicitly returns, which then raises a stop iteration. In case there is at least one argument, the while itis is equivalent to while true, and it relies on one of the iterators to raise a stop iteration after being exhausted. That stop iteration doesn't need to be catched, at least before Python 3.7, because you want the myzip to stop if one iterable is exhausted. Python 3.x. In Python 3, map returns a map instance, which will always consider true, so the while loop is equivalent to while true. However, there is one problem in Python 3.x. After iterating over a map instance once, it will be exhausted. In the first iteration of the while loop, that works as expected, but in the next iteration map will be empty and it will just create an empty list. There is nothing that could raise a stop iteration anymore, so it will go in an infinite loop and return empty tuples forever. That's also the reason you don't want to enter the while loop if the itis list is empty. It could be fixed, as stated, by using general observation. Just a note on how it would make more sense. If you want the code to be Python 3.7 compliant, thanks at Kevin for pointing this out, you explicitly need to catch the stop iterations. For more information, refer to PEP for 79. The latter code also works on Python 2.7, and Python 3.x is lower than 3.7, but it's only required to catch the stop iterations in Python 3.7+.
Why the list comprehension doesn't need to catch a stop iteration. The whole point of this loop is for next, to raise a stop iteration and the list comprehension not to catch it. It's how this generator exits. The while loop is essentially endless, the condition it tests is stable. That way the generator stops neatly when one of the inputs has been exhausted. The stop iteration exception was raised by the next call on the first iterator in iters. In essence, all that while iters column does is return false if you called myzip, with no inputs at all. Otherwise, it may as well use while true column for all the difference it makes. Now in Python 3, map iter args returns an iterator, not a list. That object can only be iterated over once, but it is not considered empty, and will always have a Boolean value of true. That means that the second run through the while iters column loop, iters is true, but next I for I in iters iterates 0 times next is never called, and the required stop iteration to exit the generator is never raised. That's why the author suggested list, map iter args, as a workaround, to capture the map iterator values into a list.